welcome to the Remarque Institute. I'm its director, Stefano Viorlanos, and I'm delighted to have a chance to welcome you to today's panel. We're here to celebrate and discuss Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, which was published by Princeton University Press in August 2025, and where we should have somebody from the bookstore. Hasn't arrived yet. We hope that they'll arrive by the end of the session. 10 minutes? Okay, well, so please, as you file out eventually, please get copies of the book from the purchaser. It's a brilliant book and it concerns capitalism's treatment of nature as a free gift, or as Alyssa writes, something that can be taken without payment or punishing, something that is materially useful but that tends not to appear in exchange. And so this is a problem in matters of nature, climate, the environment, but as Alyssa writes, it is a profound problem separately as well, where, quote, capitalism limits our ability to treat non-human nature as something other than a free gift. It constrains our ability to make genuine decisions about how to value and relate to the non-human world and to take responsibility for these decisions. Put simply, as she closes that thought at the end of the introduction, capitalism limits our freedom. Now, Alyssa Battistoni is assistant professor of political science at Barnard College. She works and teaches on climate and environmental politics, capitalism, Marxism, feminism, and other topics in modern social and political thought. She has published in a broad array of journals, from academic ones like the American Political Science Review, to more popular ones like the New Left Review, Dissent, and Jacobin. Together with Alyssa, we have three also distinguished scholars to discuss the book. We didn't actually get to talk about the order in which you guys might want to go after Alyssa speaks. So if you want to confer first, it's not a bad idea. So all the way to my left, Corey Rogan is a professor of political science at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center at CUNY. He's the author of Fear, The History of a Political Idea from 2004, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin from 2011, later updated to include Donald Trump, and The Enigma of Clarence Thomas from 2019, and he blogs at coreyrogan.com. Next to Corey is Leah Aronowsky, assistant professor at the Columbia University Climate School, where she is completing a book on early environmental and energy policy and debates from the 1970s, when the crisis was at first a matter of detailed discussion. And last but not least is Kate Aronoff, a staff writer at the New Republic and a Remarque Fellow this semester. She's the author of Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, and a co-author with Alyssa, but also with Daniel Aldana Cohen and Thierry Francos, of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. And finally, also the co-editor of We Own the Future, Democratic Socialism, American Style. Now, when I was going to say that the way that we're going to go with this is that Alyssa will speak just a little bit in the beginning about the book, and then we'll have three comments in whatever order you decided to go in. I'll let them discuss a little bit, and afterward we'll go into Q&A. And before closing, let me thank Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen and Lauren Lee from the Met downstairs for organizing today for the Institute. So welcome, please join me in welcoming Alyssa.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Steph, for the introduction, for organizing this, and to Amy and Sam for making it happen. And it's really a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for coming out. So I'm just going to sort of try to give an overview of the book and its, key arguments and interventions. But then I'm really excited to hear from this fantastic panel of dream interlocutors. So I'll try to keep it relatively brief. So the book really sort of starts from this problem that'll probably be familiar to many people. In political discourse, it's become routine in recent years, almost to the point of cliche, to describe climate change as an existential threat. Scientists have proposed naming a new geological era, the Anthropocene, marked by the entrance of human activity into the fossil record. And yet in economics, the astonishing transformations of our planet are typically attributed to a surprisingly narrow cause, which is the absence of price. So, as the economist Nicholas Stern famously observed in his landmark report on the economics of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are externalities and represent the biggest market failure the world has seen. In other words, the effects of accumulating greenhouse gases aren't factors into the prices of market goods and aren't taken into account in economic decisions. And this problem is probably most glaring with respect to carbon, but it's more much broader. So the economist Pavan Sukhdev has described the economic invisibility of nature as sort of the fact that no one pays for things like the Amazon's rain factory. The economic journalist Jonathan Guthrie says, although it's the lives of peat bogs and bees that keep life possible and bearable, we have not typically attributed any value to them. And this, he says, seems like a mistake. So the gap, I think, between these discourses of existential threat and economic error is vertiginous. Is it really possible that this mistake could bring an end to life on Earth as we know it? And if so, why hasn't it been corrected? For if this is a mistake or a failure, it's one that has proven enduringly difficult to rectify. The paradox of nature's non-value is a persistent one in political economic thought. Similar observations we've seen, you can see made for decades or even centuries. At the same time, I think it's perplexing to encounter claims that nature is endangered because it doesn't appear in the market. After all, capitalism is famously said to put a price on everything. It's notoriously merciless in its disregard for moral value, religious belief, sentimental attachment. The realm of the market perpetually expands, stripping ever wider swaths of the world for parts. Markets regularly destroy things that are bought and sold, such that everything precious must be protected from them, or at least so generations of critics have claimed. So if capitalism is characterized by relentless commodification, then this failure to value many kinds of nature is puzzling. And this problem, I argue, is more profound than has typically been acknowledged, deserves more critical attention than it's received. And this is what the book is about, the problem of the free gift of nature, and more specifically about capitalism's specific failure to value non-human nature and what that means for the politics of nature and capitalism. So this is sort of the core argument of the book, and I'm going to expand on it a bit, but that capitalism systematically treats nature as a free gift, something that can be taken without payment or replenishing, something that's materially useful but tends not to appear in the form of exchange, and that this isn't sort of an accident or an oversight or a mistake. It's foundational to capitalism's internal workings and social relations. So within that book, the book has sort of three main interventions. The one is to offer a theory of the free gift of nature as what I describe as a capitalist social form, akin to the commodity. The second is to look kind of more concretely at manifestations of this phenomenon in the world and other sort of ways that they've been conceptualized, or this sort of fundamental problem has been conceptualized in political, economic, and social thought. And the third is to articulate a new critique of capitalism's treatment of nature, but also of sort of capitalism writ large. So I'm going to spend most of the time on the first one, but I'll try to just say a bit about each. So what is the free gift of nature? The idea of the free gift isn't mine. I take it from 18th and 19th century classical political economy, from people from the physiocrats to David Ricardo, who remark on the role of non-human elements in production, from the origins of sheep to soil fertility to the wind that drives mills and sails. And you can see these quite evocative descriptions across texts. And Jean-Baptiste Say has some really fun ones, the organs and viscera and sheep and so on. But in any case, there's sort of many versions of sort of what these non-human elements or often agents are. But in particular, I draw, so there's this discourse around the free gifts of nature, the gratuitous gifts of nature, production, and so on. But I draw in particular on Marx's critique of classical political economy in developing my analysis. And I want to say a brief word about my use of Marx here because it's been a big discourse or kind of conversation around how to think about Marx with respect to ecology, a number of efforts to sort of recover Marx as an ecological thinker in recent years by people like Kohei Saito. And I'll say this is not what I'm doing. I'm not really looking to Marx sort of substantively or reading him exegetically. I'm trying to draw on him instead methodologically, and I'm interested in how Marx confronts one of the core questions of ecological thought, as I understand it, the relationship between nature and society, broadly speaking, while situating that specifically within capitalism as a particular form of social organization. And as I argue, the relationship between the natural and the social is really central to his analysis of capitalism overall, often discussed in terms of precisely his discussion of social forms and content and form. So this is really key to his critique of classical political economy in general, and certainly to his critique of them on the sort of point of nature. So he argues that they've adopted a sort of naive view of the material world. They've considered the material forms of existence apart from the social conditions in which they appear in capitalist production, and they've sort of, as a result, understood value to sort of consistent in sheer material generation, as if wealth is being generated by the soil directly, when instead we have to understand the difference between sort of what we might think of as wealth and how capitalism constitutes value. He argues in volume 3 of Capital that nature is a free gift to capital alone. Essentially, capitalists alone have benefited from the various kinds of productivity gains enabled by the deployments of natural agents. They alone have really laid claim to the resulting wealth. But he doesn't say that much more about the free gift. It's kind of a brief mention. It's something that comes up in a lot of eco-socialist and eco-Marxist work, but isn't really developed. And so I really want to explore this peculiar category more because I think it actually is quite a peculiar phrase when we think about it. On the one hand, it seems redundant. It's one of the defining features of gifts that they aren't bought and sold. It's a gift is something you get by through some other mechanism or social relation. And sometimes this is understood as being this kind of gift is understood as being, kind of an expression of unidirectional generosity or almost pure altruism, something that just goes one way. The other understanding of a gift is, of course, that it's a fundamentally reciprocal relation. If we think of gift exchange or gift societies, we typically understand gifts to be something that creates a set of obligations that has to be returned such that there kind of can't be such a thing as a free gift. It's oxymoronic in that sense. And these point in kind of different directions, but usually in either understanding, gifts are treated as something kind of outside of the logic of commodity exchange and an alternative to the commodity, and maybe outside of capitalism altogether, something that sort of explodes the logic of exchange. I think the free gift is neither of these. The free gift is distinctive and it's very much not outside of capitalism at all. Rather, I would say it's constituted by capitalism. And here I think the modifier free is telling, provides us a clue that the free gift is a category defined in relation to the market. It's free in the sense of costless or gratuitous. It denotes something priced at zero. So I argue free gifts only become, natural agents, or this category of natural agents that are at work in the world become free gifts only within capitalist social relations, in a situation of generalized commodity exchange and market dependence, where most human labor is sold for a wage and production is oriented not towards the generation of use values, but accumulation of abstract value, and only where most things have a price. After all, does it even really make sense to describe nature's gifts as free? So I argue the free gift is a distinctively capitalist social form. It's how nature tends to appear in capitalist societies. And here I'm drawing on Marx's, again, sort of analysis of the social form and the question he poses to political economy about why this content assumes this particular form, why sort of, these particular activities take the specific social form they do. He's interested, of course, in the commodity as the elementary social form of capitalism, and that's sort of, what he's interrogating in Capital. And the commodity for Marx is characterized by its dual character. It has what he describes as both material content and social form, sometimes described as natural form and value form, but they're characterized by sort of both use and exchange value, sort of use in the sort of qualitative material sense, then the form of quantitative or abstract exchange value. And he tends to suggest, sorry, again, he tends to focus on the commodity and tends to suggest that there's nothing mysterious about things that have take the sort of natural form that are sort of use value alone. Nature tends to sort of be this category of things that have only use value and therefore are not don't need investigation. But I think that the persistence of things with use value that doesn't tend to appear in the form of exchange value should push us to ask how, in constituting some things as having value, capitalism also constitutes others as lacking it. The status of these things that sort of don't end up taking the form of the commodity changes in a society that is organized around the commodity and where the commodity is a sort of elementary social unit. So I think we need to think through more this category of usefulness lacking exchange. And so I try to apply Marx's question about the sort of the relationship of content and form, and which he uses to investigate the commodity and the status of human labor to understand and says sort of the flip side of these things, the free gift of nature, to ask why so many different kinds of non-human qualities and processes, again, from sort of sheep organs to wind to the pressure of steam, tend to take this form of the free gift of nature. And so that goes into a sort of start off with this more abstract or like higher level abstraction argument that's rooted in Marx and Marxist thought. But then I try to really take that concept out into the world in a way and sort of consider the more concrete phenomena and problems that have arisen from this paradox, and both sort of the problems and sort of different iterations of this of the free gift in practice or something in the world, but also how it's been understood in other traditions of social and political thought. So there are 4 chapters that look at sort of different, again, iterations of the free gift. So I sort of start in the hidden abode, the classic hidden abode of production, and look at the sort of forces of nature as they're channeled through things like machinery, but also at what Marx describes as the free gift of human cooperation, and how the organization of nature and labor are sort of both nature and labor are organized together to sort of unleash this free gift of human cooperation in tandem with the reorganization of nature. I look at the sorts of the things that emanate from the hidden abode of production, the forms of surplus matter that we typically describe as something like pollution, and that have been conceptualized in terms of social cost or externality in the realm of what we sometimes think of as the environment. I look at so-called reproductive labor in the space of the household or the domestic space, and ask why certain kinds of human labor have seemed to take the form of the free gift, drawing there especially on Marxist and socialist feminist thought that's investigated sort of the status of unwaged household and domestic labor. And then look at these various forms of ecosystemic activity that are necessary for regenerating human and non-human life, both sort of as a condition of production, but also just for the continuation of life on our planet writ large, which have often been conceived in terms of ecosystem services or natural capital, and sort of understood in those terms. So these chapters are more historical. They're really looking at the period, for the most part, that we now think of as the Great Acceleration, since roughly 1950. They've just seen the rapid increase of both what's often described of human activity of various kinds paired with indicators of biospheric decline. I think it's striking that nearly all of contemporary political thought has developed in this period, and much modern environmental thought, but we don't always sort of situate it in relation to that, this really transformative phenomenon of the 20th century. So these chapters are all sort of tracing how a range of thinkers, from political scientists, economists, philosophers, activists, and others, have tried to respond to these biospheric transformations in thought and action, including in work that isn't sort of billed as immediately ecological. So I look at a pretty wide range of thinkers, from people like Arthur Pigou and Ronald Coase on the externality, to Silvia Federici and William Baumol on domestic labor and service work. And these chapters try to show really how an analysis of capitalism can give us a new perspective on some familiar ecological problems, and some corresponding policies that we're used to seeing in contemporary environmental politics, from carbon taxes to biodiversity markets. But I think that the free gift also can cast capitalism itself in a new light, and I try to sort of play that out in these chapters as well. So I think of the free gift as something like the commodities shadow, and I think that when we follow it, we can kind of move into dimensions of capitalism that are often left unexplored in analyses that focus on the commodities. So we can, again, follow these things that have material effects in the world that don't seem to register in the form of price, and draw our attention to a number of sort of elements that then I think are often left out of analyses of capitalism. So to these things that have these, again, clear effects in the material world but don't seem to register. Because although the free gifts of nature are sort of, I think, invisible to capital, they, again, continue to operate both in concrete production processes and in the world writ large. And I think we need to take more seriously the dual character of capitalist social forms that aren't only, not only as abstract qualities, but material and concrete ones. Analyses of capitalism typically emphasize the sort of triumph of the capitalist social form over material content, the way that capitalism abstracts away from the concrete world, that it's comprised of sort of abstract labor, abstract time, abstract value. I think the physicality of production, the rhythms of concrete time, the specific qualities of sort of different elements of the material world tend to fall by the wayside. So I try to sort of bring rematerialized analyses of capitalism and attend to how these material qualities inform some of the processes we're used to thinking about: subsumption, investment, accumulation, and so on. And when we do that, I think we see a different set of processes than we usually attend to. So again, we're used to thinking of capitalism as something that sort of constantly advances that commodifies more of the world, that absorbs more of the world, that subsumes more of the world. But a key argument of the book is that capital doesn't just advance and absorb, it also withdraws and expels, it abdicates and neglects. And the free gift sort of, I think, can help us attend to some of these processes and these spaces of sort of the remainders or things that are that are almost left over when capital has sort of commodified or capitalized what it can and then retreats. So the last intervention, and I will wrap it up in a minute, is to offer a critique of capitalism that's rooted in, I think, a different foundation than the usual argument we have in environmental critiques of capitalism. That's rooted not in ecological effects, but in a kind of human freedom. And here I think the it can seem obvious what the grounds for an ecological critique of capitalism would be. So capitalism has long been shadowed by the charge that its satanic mills have ravaged the natural world and its calculative logic has disenchanted it. Capitalism destroys nature is sort of the basic argument. And nature in turn has often been embraced as sort of a wholesome antidote to capitalist artificiality and alienation. When we look at environmental philosophy, it has primarily focused on our ethical obligations to the natural world, debates over nature's intrinsic value, and so on. And I'm sympathetic to a lot of these projects. I share a lot of the concerns they articulate, but I think that ultimately ecological critiques of capitalism tend to take the normative status of nature itself too much for granted. They hold nature up as sort of the standard against which we measure human society. And I think this is a difficult position to hold when we take on board critical perspectives on nature itself. When we recognize that our views of nature are always historically and culturally specific, that human societies have long shaped and transformed the more than human world and vice versa, that there's sort of mutually constitutive process there. And even that the natural world itself is in a constant state of flux, so there's not sort of an obvious baseline against which you can say, that was nature and now it has been degraded or destroyed or whatever it may be. So we can't just say it's bad to transform nature. We have to assess which transformations of nature we think are bad and problematic and what they stem from and what we would do about them. And that means I think we need to understand the causes of effects we find troubling and not sort of just track effects themselves. So I argue here that the problem is really that capitalism makes us unfree. It constrains our ability both individually and collectively about how to make decisions, about how to value and relate to the non-human world and to take genuine responsibility for those decisions. So in other words, it's a critique rooted not in a set of external standards for judgment given by nature, but the belief that we should ultimately be able to make these decisions for ourselves and enact them in the world in a meaningful way. There's been an exciting revival of Marxist theories of freedom in recent years, drawing on a number of different traditions, some in drawing on the Republican vein of thought, others kind of taking a more Hegelian social freedom approach. And I'm drawing on a slightly unusual source here, which is existentialism and the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir in particular, to develop my argument. And I'm not going to go into details here, although I'm happy to if people want to hear more. But the upshot is that capitalism, I think, limits our ability to value and treat non-human nature as something other than a free gift. So there's a lot more to say, but I will leave it there. I really want to hear from everyone else. So thanks so much, and looking forward to comments and questions.
Good books provide new arguments, and great books pose new questions. And Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts is a great book. It poses one extraordinary novel question, which is, as you've already heard, if capitalism impels the commodification of everything, why has it not commodified so many parts of nature? And that question then yields other extraordinary and new questions. In answering them, Battistoni makes so many interesting moves and claims that you might miss a few. So I just want to mention only two, each worthy of a book in itself. So in one move, Battistoni analyzes the body of mainstream economics that arises in the 20th century, as you've heard, under the rubric of externalities, social costs, and cost disease. After pointing out that each of those issues has a common element, which is that they all arise in the spheres of nature or the body, Battistoni does something that echoes what Marx did with Smith and Ricardo. Instead of ignoring or rejecting this literature, as so many of Marx's comrades did to the economics of their day, Battistoni mines it for truths that economists, ethicists, and environmentalists tend to avoid. So to the economists, Battistoni points out that their theory of externalities follows from what Pigou calls a violent paradox. And that is that a society that uses the measuring rod of money as an instrument of valuation will systematically, and that is not contingently or exceptionally, but systematically produce market failures, particularly in the natural world, that cannot be easily resolved through the market. And to ethicists and environmentalists who think it's immoral to put a price on toxic waste or to trade in pollution rights, Battistoni argues that waste and pollution are parts of production and exchange. They're costs, like wages or rent. The question is how to price those costs and who should pay for them. If the price is too high, maybe that's telling us something that we need to change about how we organize the economy. Battistoni's second move, and she makes many of them, I'm just focusing on these two because I just want to make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle. Battistoni's second move is how she brings together the literatures on the environment and social reproduction, where progressives often argue that the connecting thread of how we treat nature and social reproduction is our belief that these are female-coded spheres. Battistoni insists that our actions in these spheres are not the results of beliefs, but of material realities that have been pressed through a sieve of capitalist valuation. And what I mean by that is that under capitalism, value depends upon increases in the productivity of labor, whether achieved through technology and innovation or management and control. Increases in labor productivity often or ultimately decrease the number of workers. Capitalists will always be drawn to industries, in other words, where they can increase labor productivity or decrease the number of workers and thereby increase profits. Now, no matter how hard they try, capitalists, that is, activities that depend intensively on physical and biological processes, such as agriculture or social reproduction in the household, are not as amenable to increases in labor productivity or decreases in the number of workers as are other activities. The twin force of those limits, and they're hard limits, Battistoni argues, and that is limits on increases in productivity and decreases in the number of workers, means that nature and social reproduction will be systematically devalued by capital as a source or a limited source of profit making. Because they are devalued, they follow the path that anything with low value in a capitalist society takes. That is, they'll be disregarded or disposed of. So I think those are two, I found really interesting claims that she develops. And as I said, there's many more. I just want to pose sort of two questions. First, Battistoni makes a very strong case that nature only, quote, becomes a free gift under capitalism. As she says, the free gift is a distinctively capitalist social form. It arises in societies where something can be useful, even vitally necessary to life, and yet worthless. Or conversely, drawing from, is it Sean Nye? I don't know how to pronounce her name. I assume that's how. Sean Nye's theory of the gimmick. It arises in societies where something can be useless, unnecessary to life itself, yet extremely valuable. The question I have is that true only under capitalism? Is that really the case? Since the Greeks, people have obsessed over what economists call the paradox of value. Things that are scarce but useless are expensive. Things that are plentiful but vital are cheap. Plato, in one of his dialogues, cites Pindar, the Greek poet, to say, quote, "It is the rare thing which is the precious one, and water is cheapest, even though it is best." Pufendorf cites the Greco-Roman skeptic Sextus Empiricus. I think that's how you pronounce it. And this is the quote from Sextus E. Quote, Those things that are scarce are valued. Those that grow among us and are everywhere to be had are quite otherwise. If water were difficult to be met with, how much more valuable would it be than the things we most value now? Or if gold lay in the streets as common as stones, who do you think would value it or lock it up? End quote. Grotius cites Plutarch, Ovid, and Virgil to similar effect, even describing water as a, quote, public gift. Now, Battistoni may respond that it's only capitalism that turns this sort of theorized tension between value and the free gift into what's called a real abstraction. But I'm not sure that we know that to be true. The question of the extent of the market in the ancient world is extremely controversial, but minimally, there's lots of evidence to suggest that before capitalism, nature was understood and acted upon as a free gift. Battistoni might respond that relative to the economic systems that came before it, capitalism does to nature what she was referring to as the Great Acceleration, what later productivity enhancements in manufacturing do to the household labor, and that is to make the latter relatively less profitable and less valued. But if that's true, it suggests that when it comes to nature, capitalism imposes more of a change in degree, maybe, than in kind. So just something I would like to hear more about. But it leads to my second and last question. There's a character / idea that doesn't get that much play in Battistoni's book, but which I think complicates the story slightly, and that is David Ricardo's theory and his theory of rent. In Battistoni's book, Ricardo's theory of rent and its relationship to nature appears almost exclusively in the guise of Marx, who gets his argument from Ricardo, but who omits one critical feature of Ricardo's argument. As Battistoni points out, Marx claims that rent arises from essentially two factors. One is ownership, the legal fact that people own and control specific assets, and the other is that the value of that asset was generated entirely by nature. Rent reflects no labor or investment by its owner. It's just a free gift of nature that happens to be owned. Battistoni says that the free gift of nature is remarkably under-theorized by Marx, which probably is true of Marx, but it's actually not true of Ricardo. While Ricardo thinks that nature's gifts can be free, they're only free in the sense that I think Battistoni is concerned with in a particular circumstance, and that is where those gifts are plentiful and of equal quality. That circumstance, says Ricardo, arises pretty much only in the early days of society's development. As populations get bigger, societies push to farm more and more marginal land at the sort of the periphery of the society. Marginal land requires more labor, which drives up the value and thus the price of the products of that labor. And through no effort of their own, the owners of the original, more fertile lands that were back in the beginning benefit from the higher value and the higher price of the product that's farmed on the marginal lands. That's about the most economics I can handle, so that'll be it. That benefit from higher prices comes back to the owner in the form of rent. So like Marx, Ricardo thinks rent arises from the social fact of ownership and the free gift of nature. But unlike Marx, he thinks that the free gift becomes economically consequential or relevant in the context of scarcity. Then and only then does it acquire a price in the form of rent. And I think this matters for two reasons. And then I'll be finished. First, it suggests that there is a tradition within mainstream economics that does theorize nature as a free gift. And that tradition, which tends to focus an awful lot on scarcity and continues long after Ricardo, I think doesn't get as much play in Battistoni's book as it might. And the second, more important, is that while Battistoni is skeptical, and I think for very good reasons, that ownership and rent can solve or even remotely address the problem of climate change or the environment, she doesn't consider what I think is the darker implication of Ricardo's argument. And that is, as much as scarcity is a product of population growth or diminishing resources, it's created by ownership. And when nature is owned and gifts are unequally distributed by nature, scarcity is created and so is rent, and people are now forced to pay for benefits that they previously enjoyed for free. Battistoni argues that so far, at least, it's been very hard to get capital to attach a price to things like clean air or clean water because there's been little to no profit relative to other investments to be gained from them. But Ricardo gives us reasons to think that does not need to remain the case. There are scenarios in which capital could find itself in a similar position to the rentier landlord. In a world of ever more polluted land, polluted air and water, fertile land, fresh water, clean air becomes scarce, and thus massive sources of income and wealth garnered not as productivity or investment-based profit, but as rents born of scarcity. I don't think this Ricardian story requires Battistoni to give up her arguments or her theory. I think, in fact, it makes her case for collective ownership of the commons that much more powerful. Thank you.
I'll start by saying congratulations, Alyssa. This is truly a monumental piece of scholarship. You got a little sense of the range and variety of arguments that Alyssa is putting forward through Corey's comments just now. I just want to echo that and sort of plug the book, so to speak. It's full of insights and engagements. It's exciting theoretically. It feels really fresh. It's eclectic and Catholic in its engagements with theory. She's working with everyone from Hayek to de Beauvoir to Indigenous scholars like Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I think it's to everyone's benefit that she does that. I also think it says something about the state of environmental thinking that, you know, for so long, I think there's been a sort of commitment to ideological purity that has led to an avoidance of engaging with some of these thinkers. And so I really commend you for being brave in who you think we should be taking seriously. I'll say a little bit about how I understand the interventions of the book, and then I'll kind of open up to areas for discussion. So from my vantage as a sort of historian of environmental thought, as I see it, the world of environmental political thought has really been stuck in a kind of impasse for the past few decades. It's been unable to find a way to make a case for taking the environment seriously in our political spheres without falling back on appeals to moral virtues or an ethics of care, right? So you could think of anything from the multi-species turn in the humanities. You could think of an anthropologist like Anna Singh and her methodological program of the, quote, arts of noticing. You could think of Jane Bennett, her program of the assemblage and her elaborating of a theory of distributed forms of agency that nearly extend to the non-human. We could also talk about Bruno Latour and his turn later in life to the Gaia hypothesis. Just to say a word about that, Latour's turn to the Gaia hypothesis as a means of elaborating a political philosophy that's anchored in dependence rather than freedom, right? So for Latour, the fact that we depend on all these different creatures in order to live, algae for oxygen, microbes for soil health, et cetera, allows us to elaborate an ethics of care that is organized around self-interest, right? Like when you reframe the natural world through that lens, suddenly it becomes in humans' own interest to protect the things that they literally rely on to live, right? And Jane Bennett actually offers a similar conclusion through her assemblage program. I'll quote her here. So, such a newfound attentiveness to matter and its powers can inspire a greater sense of the extent to which all bodies are kin in the sense of inextricably enmeshed in a dense network of relations. In a knotted world of vibrant matter, to harm one section of the web may very well be to harm oneself. Such an enlightened or expanded notion of self-interest is good for humans. So I think many of us have been really skeptical about the idea that an environmental politics that's organized around sort of close attention to the other or recognition of a shared kinship, that sort of recognition move alone will necessarily lead to an ethos of environmental care and stewardship. And I know it's a skepticism that Alyssa has long shared. So I say all this as preamble to just convey to the extent to which Alyssa's critique of capitalism as a system of unfreedom really, to my mind, offers a way out of this impasse that environmental scholarship has been stuck in. It's really offering an alternative to this moralized appeal to nature, right? It's getting us out of that framework. So to this end, I think it's a genuinely novel and, dare I say, groundbreaking contribution to our ability to think and theorize about environmental politics. So to just say a little bit more about what I have in mind there, in Alyssa's telling, we become challenged to reframe the history of the sort of post-war era, a period typically associated with the rapid intensification of economic growth, an attendant rise in living standards and increasing freedoms. In Alyssa's telling, that's actually a period of an intensification of the unfreedoms of capitalism, right? Like we're continually locking ourselves deeper and deeper into a system that forces us to narrow our ability to truly choose in a market. To quote Alyssa here, capitalist freedom is a perversion rather than the realization of existentialist freedom, insofar as it undercuts our ability to make genuine choices and to take genuine responsibility for our decisions. Okay. So as I was reading it, two sort of thoughts came to mind. The first area that I think would be interesting to hear you talk more about, Alyssa, is where to locate the state in your analysis, right? So for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I highly recommend you do. Alyssa addresses the state as part of a discussion on this concept of ecosystem services, right? Sort of getting back to this idea that humanity literally relies on nature to keep the air clean in theory, et cetera, et cetera. And she points out that if we reframed this ecosystem services concept as a public good, the state might be compelled to act in ways that actually diverge from the interests of capital, right? It would be removing land from the private sphere and sort of rewilding, protecting watersheds so that we can continue to have clean water and the ecosystems there can thrive, et cetera, et cetera. So she has this beautiful gesture to one way in which the state could be encouraged to operate against the interest of capital, right? And that's really intriguing to me. And I think that there's actually a few other ways that we could think about the ways that the state here could serve a more ambiguous position, right? So as I was reading, I was thinking a lot about the 1970s, a period I work on, and this remarkable moment in the history of the United States when the federal government passed a series of landmark environmental laws that were explicitly not rooted in a framework of capitalist valuation of nature. Instead, they were grounded in the logic of rights and the natural right to an environment free from degradation. So the 1970 Clean Air Act, for example, stipulated that air quality standards needed to be set at a level that would, quote, protect the public welfare from any known or anticipated adverse effects associated with air pollutants. And it also stipulated that economic cost, the cost of protecting the air in this way, could not be taken into account when setting standards for air quality. In a similar vein, the 1972 Clean Water Act stipulated that the discharge of pollutants into the nation's waterways must simply be eliminated by 1985, right? Pretty radical. So in other words, it's a moment when the federal government is effectively trying to just straight up ban pollution in the name of protecting individual Americans' rights to clean air and clean water. And of course, as you can imagine, this was immediately chipped away at by industry, and it also intersected with this moment when there was a sort of increasing reliance on the cost-benefit analysis as a way to assess how far various law regulations should go. But it also points to a moment kind of before economics really had such a hold on the way we think about environmental regulations, right? Like economists were really left out of this conversation when these laws were being formulated. So I suppose I say all this just to sort of suggest to you thinking about this rights-based framework and thinking about sort of whether there's a possibility here going forward. It also made me think about, this odd moment we have today in the US where there's a sort of turn to repoliticize the environment on this part of the MAHA movement, right? Like suddenly we're seeing a sort of demand for protections that would lead to a sort of, quote, purer environment. We want pure food sources, pure getting big pharma out of the business of writing of FDA regulation, et cetera, et cetera. And so here's another interesting moment where sort of maybe the interests of progressive thought and the interests of the right are starting to converge. The other big question that was on my mind, and maybe it's just because COP was happening until maybe a few days ago, was the question of China. And I think a project that's thinking about the relationship between freedom, unfreedom in the natural world necessarily points us to this conversation that is emerging at the moment. There's a lot of pearl clutching going on about the remarkable rise of China and what it might mean for Western ideas of progress and closely held liberal values. Last winter, Adam Tooze went so far as to suggest that China's emergence as the decisive agent of change in the global energy transition and its emergence more generally as the sort of new inventor of modernity, that this emergence signals a need to fundamentally rethink Western philosophies of history. Whether or not you agree with this kind of characterization, it is true that China's rise raises questions about the relationship between freedom, political systems, and environmental protection. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what you make of these sort of alternative configurations of the freedom-unfreedom nature dyad, and whether you also want to think about, just tell us what we should think a little bit about this in a moment. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I would second everyone else's praise for this book. I don't read a whole lot of political theory just by matter of trade, and so it was a nice surprise, not surprise because I know what a gifted writer you are and thinker, but it is just such an elegantly constructed book and really pays off sort of toward the end. Really builds to I think a really interesting and generative place by the end of the book. And so I would also second the plug. Obtain the book if you haven't already. It's not free probably, but sorry. That is, we exist in the contradictions. So I think this book comes at a really good moment. Obviously it's been long gestating, but arrives at a moment where environmental politics are not, I would say, at a historic high point, particularly in the United States. And there's a lot of sort of introspection. And I think the sort of recent failures of things like the Inflation Reduction Act, of, the dismantling of some of these big landmark environmental and climate regulations, both here and abroad, has prompted a sort of openness about, thinking through what it is we do about not just the sort of climate crisis in a narrow sense, but more broadly the sort of ecological crisis, which is coming through in the sort of increasing reality of rising temperatures, right? In the sort of pressures that rising temperatures are placing on ecology and on our sort of lived reality as people who live in a warming world. And there, is this sort of parallel to the kind of intellectual rigidity in environmental thinking in the climate movement itself, right? And so that is, far, I think, downstream, like whether people who are lobbying or in kind of a suite of nonprofits who've been in this space for a long time think of it in terms of specific thinkers, I don't know, but you can see the sort of lineage through and many of the arguments made in the book, and to, how people articulate their politics and their campaigns. And so I think the premium on moralism, especially in parts of the climate left where I have spent a lot of time, is, I think due for a kind of rethink about, how is it that we formulate campaigns, and how is it that we think about actually, trying to get to a place of winning things again. And so, I like a lot of people in this world, in climate world, I've been sort of thinking through the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act and this like last decade of climate politics that we've been living through. And through the book, you get this sort of like interesting trajectory of ways that people have thought about how to deal, not necessarily with nature and the ecological crisis broadly, but with the climate crisis more narrowly. And sort of that focus on the climate crisis emerges specifically in the last like 2 or 3 years, and to exclude sort of broader conversations about nature and about protection. And so from the sort of ecosystem services debate that you lay out, this kind of natural capital obsession that, you will hear in places like COP30 or in Davos, less so now, but as of a decade ago, and for much of the last decade, that was sort of the watchword in these sort of global elite climate making spaces. And so the pitch there, right, as you lay out, is to place value on these positive externalities. So if we can just assess the value of a whale, if we can say that that's worth $2 million and that whales collectively are worth $1 trillion, then that will mean something, right? And that will tell everyone about the value of these valuable ecological systems, or a little more crassly, in certain forms of carbon markets, right? And so you're paying people to preserve tracts of land, whether or not they're under threat, which is the reason why many of the systems, one reason why many of the systems don't really work. And so the ecosystem services conversation is, how do we track these positive externalities? As you lay out, that process is really difficult because a lot of these are not, you can't truly value these kinds of externalities, right? They are kind of ungovernable in a certain way, and there's no interest from capital in doing that, right? This is not an inherently valuable product. And so alongside that, and sort of what becomes the watchword of global climate politics, is carbon pricing out of that. And so you have this attempt to institute cap and trade systems, successfully in some cases, or carbon pricing systems, which says, okay, if we can't govern or make sense of or bring into the market these positive externalities, then we can put a price on the negative externalities, right? We can make sure that we're punishing people who are creating either pollution or making sure that they have a place to trade those goods, forming carbon into some sort of commodity. And that is a political loser. It works in some places, and there are sort of like reasonably functioning carbon pricing systems. It does not solve the sort of grand things that they set out to solve in sort of making progress in reducing emissions globally, or in certainly dealing with any sort of larger ecological or natural crises. What it can do in some narrow circumstances is to generate revenue for certain other types of investment, such as, at the state level, something like RGGI in New York State. California's cap and trade system has been reasonably effective in creating revenue streams for certain kinds of things. And so in the last 5 or so years, since 2021, there's been this sort of new phase out of the carbon pricing conversation, at least in the United States, and I think arguably Europe and other places, but a transition to thinking about green industrial policy. The sort of punchline of which is to create positive externality machines and also make sure that those are commodities in and of themselves. So if we can, incentivize companies to make solar panels, to make wind turbines, to incentivize geothermal, then that will, in itself make the use values self-evident, right? That there will be the sort of inherent value to reducing emissions, to creating jobs. And And this is done on the one level, on the one hand, to satisfy these sort of like domestic and political concerns, right? Nobody seems to know what carbon pricing is, whereas people like it when you say jobs, and like it when you say investment and private sector and all that kinds of stuff. But it totally skips over what I think is the a really valuable portion of the book, which is this conversation about what value actually is. And in expecting sort of use values of these like lower carbon technologies to be self-evident, totally ignores the fact that there's no exchange value for that, because there has not been a sort of reevaluation of what it is that makes these things valuable. And there's no actual market value. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the corner of this that I've paid the most attention to, just comes up against the fact that the market does not value any of this, that the sort of externalities that whether it's electric vehicles or solar panels or any of these sort of green industries that the law incentivized are just not in themselves valuable enough to generate a profit. And also nobody is valuing the externalities. Nobody is valuing sort of the fact that electric vehicles pollute less than an internal combustion engine, or that a solar panel, renewable energy, can provide lower carbon emissions, right? That is not factored in. And even the way that like people who wrote the IRA talk about it is to say, because there's no mechanism in the law for, placing limits on carbon or to regulate carbon, they talk about climate benefits as an externality of this law. And so it is a sort of afterthought just in the statute of the bill. And yeah, I just think it really, underlines that there is no skipping the sort of like values conversation about what it is that the policy is chasing. And I think the last decade or so of climate policy has been about trying to figure out these fixes kind of around the actual nature of the problem, around either sort of ecological crises or climate. If you just talk about climate politics in terms of these sort of lower carbon goods and in terms of the sort of use values of either, clean energy jobs or carbon reduction, lower pollution, that will, make the case obvious to people in this sort of moralistic way. But that has not proven to be the case, right? And I think, and I'll wrap up soon, but I think the upshot of all this, and I think the beginning of sort of a conversation about what productive climate politics looks like moving forward, is that you have to take the reality of the crisis seriously. You can't just sort of have this be a conversation about creating ever more sort of low carbon goods. That there is this real opportunity as the effects of rising temperatures become more and more obvious, to really reframe this conversation. What so many of the people in the book, their interventions are to make obvious these negative externalities, right? To have this sort of political debate about, how do we price carbon? We have to make it clear that these things are bad, and that this free lunch, as Barry Commoner says, actually has these sort of blowback effects. That is really being translated into actual affordability concerns that people are dealing with in the here and now, whether that's insurance costs or these sort of escalating rents. That point has been made, and it is just more manifest than it was 10 years ago, when a lot of these sort of like narratives about what the climate crisis looks like were being formulated. So I think having, we're all sort of in the muck of figuring out what climate politics can look like. I think the book provides a really sort of instructive way to think not just about this sort of broader conception of an ecological crisis beyond this kind of narrow question of decarbonization and carbon emissions, but to think through, what is it that we want society to look like, right? And to have this sort of like more foundational conversation about, what a good life entails, and how to live a good life on a planet that is rapidly transforming in dramatic ways. And I don't have questions necessarily, but yeah, I am just curious to hear what you think, just since writing the book, about the sort of like evolution of climate politics, which has shifted a lot, I think, since you finished, and including in good ways through things like the Zoran campaign and yeah, what this new phase may look like.
So before you get started, let me just say that, why don't you take like 5 minutes to respond? But why don't I ask you to please formulate questions in your head? I'm going to give like maximum 45 minutes for 45 seconds, not 45 minutes. For actually asking a question, and I will appreciate if there's a question mark at the end of the question once we start with the discussion. So please raise your hands as you go, but please formulate in the meanwhile. I'm going to ask you additional, it's now about 1:38. If you want to leave at 1:55 exactly. And we'll go over a little bit past 2 o'clock. So that this way it's not like somebody walking past every couple of minutes or so, but just wait until then. Thank you. Okay, Alyssa, the floor is yours again.
Great. First of all, thank you all so much. These are really fantastic comments and questions. And again, it's really a delight to be talking with all of you who I've learned from and thought with along the years. So it's really just, I really appreciate it. I'll try to be very brief and some really big and challenging questions, and I'll just, I guess, just go online. So to begin, I think, Corey, you put some really good and challenging questions around, like, is this a distinctively capitalist story? And certainly there are many versions, I guess, of I think ways to take nature as some kind of gift, and certainly the idea of nature as a gift is a much longer standing one. I do think this kind of paradox you're describing, or I guess I would say, like, leaving aside sort of paradox of value, the tricky question around, like, when when do some of these dynamics become distinctively capitalist? Like, we can see some elements of like markets or wage labor, like, many kinds of things that people identify as being core features of capitalism in earlier and even ancient societies. And so, on some level, there is always kind of is there always a change in degree, I guess, and like, what is the moment when we identify this as capitalism? Obviously, it's like a massive debate. But I do think that the sort of that's just not the extent of, well, I guess there are a couple of things. I think one is the sort of idea of commodity exchange and market dependence as a sort of central feature of society is quite important. And I think with it, I try to really argue in the book, and I'll say a little bit about this, like, that the way we sort of think about non-human nature, sort of the relation to non-human nature, isn't so much about like how we see the non-human world or something like that, but it's sort of downstream from a changing relationships amongst human beings, and in particular the constitution of a class division of where human labor becomes primarily wage labor, where people are selling their labor power to someone else and having that directed as sort of that is like the model of labor, and that's how labor is primarily organized. And I do think that creates a very sort of constitutive wagelessness of non-human nature, and sort of sharpens this division that, again, there's always divisions between how nature and or like non-human entities and human labor are used in any kind of society, but there's something that I think really sharpens this distinction in a capitalist society. I sort of try to trace a sort of thin account of a human capacities that become important in within capitalism, in order to try to draw out what do I think is happening in this change in social relations. And so I do think there's something significant about both that kind of shift in class relations and the sort of broader condition of not just there are markets, but you are in a broadly market dependent society, that makes the sort of status of nature, again, like shifts, or like elements where you might have, there might be pockets within the same way that you might have, forms of commodity exchange in a pre-capitalist society. But that is not it's not the elementary form of social life, and sort of that is not the way people primarily relate to one another. And I think that has a downstream effect on how nature's status becomes almost universalized in some sense. I think the Ricardo Ryan question is a great one, and sort of points to a sort of shift in the book that I think actually probably could be narrated more directly, or maybe a shift between different ways of thinking about value in the book that I probably could have narrated more explicitly. So I think there's, as I described, there's kind of this broader Marxist argument that's drawing very much on Marxist value form theory, and trying to, again, develop an account of why I think nature, is sort of lacking in value, and is, which is almost axiomatic for Marx in a way. But I try to sort of develop an account of why is this the case? Like, how do we understand the sort of the significance of human labor and the sort of constitution of nature in opposition to it? and to really understand something about value as a social relation and a social relation between human beings. And that is something that does, I think, sort of foundationally exclude non-human nature, and trying to, again, track why and how I think that is. But then a lot of the later chapters that are trying to engage with, again, like mainstream economics and the way that Corey described, are engaging with something that is like, you know, with economists who are doing a version of marginalist economics, who are thinking about you know, the value in terms of scarcity, supply and demand, about like the extension, about something that is much closer to the Ricardian, or at least like the kind of view of like you know, marginal land. Although leaving aside the Ricardian labor theory value itself. So anyway, so there is something that is, I think, a shift there where they're interested in things like precisely scarcity, ownership, you know, whether or not you can you know, kind of make these whether if you own these things, you can make them scarce. And, you know, a lot of the debate around natural capital ecosystems and services, they say the problem is it's not natural resources, which, you know, it's not that natural resources are going to be scarce, because people do like develop, you know, own those, and the prices go up and people develop technological substitutes. Is what they call free but scarce public resources that are not being captured in the form of, you know, are not being owned, and sort of you can't charge rents, you can't sort of you know, represent them in that form. And I do talk about rent a little bit. I actually really wish, I do think I should have said a lot more about rent. I came to realize late in writing the book, but a little bit about rent is sort of the only way that nature is able to sort of appear in this in this form of social organization. Okay, 2 minutes. So I will move on from rent. But basically, like, I agree. I think there's a lot to say there. And I do think a lot of the debates that I'm trying to look at around in those later chapters, ownership does end up being key for how do you you know, like, constitute pollution as a right to pollution as something you can buy and sell. Property rights are really important for all of these attempts to bring nature in, and I do think they actually run up against serious limits in many of these cases. And I think there are some that might be you might be able to sort of create scarcity around, and others that I think are kind of more what an economist would call pure public good and quite difficult, which maybe moves a bit into some of Leah's question about the state and the significance of states and actually sometimes constituting forms of property rights in these things, and also like creating sometimes scarcity, but by creating sort of demand through like regulation, like kind of like creating scarcity through regulation rather than like physical scarcity. So the state, I would say the state really comes into the picture, like, or the story around the edges. And this is another thing that I feel like I've come to really feel like that eco-Marxism in general does not have like a theory of the state. Like there's like a lot of really great eco-Marxist work happening right now, but the state is always kind of like not there. And as a political theorist, I am sheepish to say that is also true for my book, but I'm working on it now. I am trying to work on a book about the state and climate and you know, state, climate, capital, all these things that I think, you know, so my comments on all of this are quite you know, going to be quite like tentative in some way, but I do think the state is quite important for certainly for in some chapters for like creating some of these commodities, not only making markets, creating, you know, kind of certifying credits, but again, you literally have to make demand for them because they are too generous to be scarce. And so there has to be this kind of like artificial, I talk about this as artificial abstractions in the book, but this is sort of instead of the kind of process that we see as capital kind of moving of its own accord, there is this politically constituted version of it, or something that has to make it you know, make the commodity form work in a way. And I haven't, you know, like totally figured out what I think is happening there, but I think it's a really, you know, they're quite strange commodities where they do exist. And there's something I think, you know, important there to think about what are the political possibilities, but also constraints, and like, how do we think about, you know, the state as a capitalist state? And I think that, you know, leads into, I mean, I probably have like less than a minute now, so I'll try to talk about China and the contemporary climate politics in 30 seconds or less. But I do think this speaks to the question of China, certainly. And I think, you know, I've been thinking more about like how, like what I have been thinking, like what does, you know, how to understand China within the story. Maybe a little bit less than thinking about freedom and more in like how to understand Chinese capitalism, which I would say is capitalist, but is just, you know, has distinctive features and does have obviously like a different kind of I think degrees of, I mean, it's both, I think, a value-driven society, one that does have some degrees of I don't even know how to say freedom, but like movement within that are politically constituted, and thinking about what is the role of the state in capitalism and how that's operating in China today, I think is really significant for, I mean, that's what I'm trying to think about in terms of like how to understand this particular formation and ways that, again, because like a lot of people I'm looking at in the book are much more, it's like critiques of people who are very on the, like free market as the mode of, as sort of an expression of this is like pure capitalism. And that's obviously not sort of the only way that capitalism can operate. It's sort of an ideology of capitalism, but it's not sort of the only, like actually existing capitalism takes is like a lot of different relations of state and capital. And so I don't have like a great answer to it other than I want to understand how to think about that particular configuration more. And I think the book, like I think some of the core arguments of the book would hold, but like look quite different, basically. And I think relatedly, on Kate's question, yeah, that's also sort of what's motivating me trying to think about the state more now. Because like, yeah, the book began in a lot of ways with this, when we were in this mode of the only way to think about climate and other environmental problems was through this kind of missing prices lens. And that was the dominant policy solution and sort of political analysis. And so, it's both like, why is this the case? Like, how is this how we come to think about these? And trying to understand that kind of like almost like a genealogy of the development of this idea. But then I think there is a real, the problem of the free gift does persist through the kind of the reorientation towards more green industrial policy mode, a state intervention that's trying to constitute these new green technologies. There's some interesting work in Andreas Malm and Wim Carton's latest book about reasons that renewables are much more difficult to make profitable, not only because of some of what Brett Christopher has described as some of the problems with electricity markets, but also partly because it's hard to make them scarce. Like to go back to this question of scarcity, wind and sun are not scarce goods, and so it's harder to have kind of to control the revenues that might stem from some of these technologies, even where they're implemented. You might again have to have a kind of state come in to constitute some kind of or like help back a cartel or monopoly power over some of these kinds of industries that are not going to, it's going to be very difficult as a competitive market for these to ever make money. And so anyway, so I think there are versions of these problems that appear in, again, slightly different forms than I'm describing, but I haven't fully worked that out yet. So but these are the questions that I'm basically, I'm trying to think about now. So I'm very glad that you've all raised them, and thanks again for great questions. And sorry to go over by a bunch of minutes.
So in the back, would you mind please introducing yourselves as you ask your question?
My name's Christian Bailey. I teach at a CUNY campus. Thanks a lot. I guess I had the same feeling as the first commentator that the question of why capitalism hasn't commodified nature is a brilliant one. As I was listening to you, I was wondering if that's 100% true. And here, the comparison that popped into my head was between your notion of the free gift within capitalism and Jason Moore's idea of capitalism creating cheap nature. I was thinking about, natural resources, even basic ones like water, they seem to be initially to be expensive in terms of the labor that they cost and the time it takes to kind of make them useful or valuable. And what capitalism has done really well is to make them ever cheaper, right? Until it doesn't, right? And so now we're in a world of droughts and desertification, become more and more expensive. But then I was thinking about your starting point of, why is it this big gap between climate change as a market failure and as a kind of environmental catastrophe or as a kind of humanitarian catastrophe? I can see how the stereotypical American neoliberal can't price in desertification or something. They can't price in the environmental costs because they're worrying about quarterly figures for shareholders. But couldn't the German ordo liberal, the social market capitalist, isn't there a way that they could kind of figure this in? So does there have to be this enormous gap between kind of imagining nature as a market failure versus nature as, or natural disasters as a kind of, existential crisis?
I'm Carolyn Trotko. I'm a visiting fellow at Remarque. Thank you for all of this. I keep coming back to the point about free gifts only existing under capitalism, and Corey Robin's comment put that into dialogue with earlier economic systems, which I found really useful. But in my head, I jumped immediately to the sort of 20th century alternative, which staged socialism in Europe. And I think that particularly in relation to the observation about how capitalism devalues both environmental and social reproduction, it's actually very interesting. Thinking about a place like East Germany, where social reproduction, we can talk about the sort of limits and deficiencies of this, but social reproduction was sort of valued more, but the environment was like ruthlessly degraded in all of these places. I think that sort of divergence is very indicative, and I wonder if it then requires us to sort of accept that, you know, adding price tag or sort of valuing nature in different ways actually won't solve the problem, that it's a sort of more fundamental one. And if that sort of gets us back to these sort of Latourian ideas about like parliaments of things and sort of accepting agency actors in a way that's a little bit more abstract and sort of harder to deal with modern people.
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that capitalism can never commodify nature. I think actually, I guess this is where I try to say draw the distinction between the free gift as a social form as something that's sort of like the default or sort of the general form of nature. And then, you know, there obviously are processes of transformation, commodification, again, like constituting things as property, charging rents, like there's like a lot of natures that are priced. Although I would still say the vast majority of the non-human world that exists is not like most of, you know, most, sometimes it's surprising to think about how few like capital has, you know, kind of subsumed and commodified and produced as like, you know, commodities. I mean, they now make up most of the biomass on the planet. But most of like the stuff that exists in the world does not actually kind of has not been brought into like the capitalist orbit. That said, I think, yes, capitalism can, you know, I think this is sort of, and again, maybe narrates for the shift between like this kind of broader, like what is the level of the social form or like more concrete processes of bringing in. And I think my difference with Jason Moore's document, which I've learned a lot with, I think there's a lot of like similarities in ways, but I think one is I think I would disagree on, well, some of the kind of constitution of like cheap labor is nature's energy. I mean, I think capitalism wants to make things cheap in general, but I'm not sure just calling them all cheap is like gives us that much purchase on the specific versions of that, or like cheap labor, cheap nature sort of as equivalently cheap as I think, I guess I find it not always very clear, but I think more significantly, he does have I think his account of how capitalism makes things cheap is actually more akin to the kind of the Marxist feminist account of naturalization that I criticize as being, I think, too ideologically grounded. It's like a Cartesian dualism, and like it's rooted in capitalist like active processes of that there's some sort of ideological mystification going on in making nature cheap and in sort of constituting forms of like making nature legible as part of it. I think it's a bit more of a, I guess, like an active, intentional process, it seems sometimes, and Moore's account of how nature is being made cheap than I want to give. And I think that partly is how he's drawing on people like Maria Mies, who are in turn drawing on Silvia Federici and so on. But I mean, I could go into that more. But so I think, yeah, nature is. I'll stop there. On the couldn't they price it in? Yes, I think again on this. Can you sometimes price in individual natures? Yes, I think definitely. There have been some successful markets in like sulfur dioxide or things like you can occasionally kind of make one of these work or price a certain, kind of create a market in a sort of subset of things. Like I guess again, I would say there are many, many kinds of natures. I think that like the default form is the free gift. You can kind of try to correct those in places. But I do think it's a quite, again, it's an extremely like laborious and complicated process. And this, what I'm talking about is not the kind of real abstraction of like the kind of how we are sort of unconsciously acting and compelled by capitalist dynamic, but quite the opposite, a very intentional and conscious process of trying to constitute certain elements as having value in opposition to what, kind of the otherwise state of affairs would be. And I think that with carbon, so I think you can do it around the edges, but I do think that for some kinds, like on certain, both on certain scales and also for particular sort of like elements of non-human nature, it becomes very, very difficult to the point of impossible. Internalizing all the externalities is like a utopian in a pejorative sense project, and that it's like, it requires a kind of pricing of like literally every physical element of the world, which, even that is like, which ones do is carbon the most significant one? We've only thought of carbon as being a significant one in the past, few decades. And so, that is also can always be a sort of a shifting boundary. So I think there are these kind of shifting attempts to address particular instances of this more general phenomenon that I don't think is going to change. On the state socialism, so I do think on the one hand, like, I guess I wouldn't say that the analysis or critique of capitalism means that other kinds of like social organization, right, especially state socialism, which is hard to I think even fully detach from capitalism or say like this is an entirely different or separate system. But that those can't also ruthlessly degrade non-human nature. Like, and in some ways, what I'm trying to say with freedom as the argument is that not that we would definitely that would like be the path to sustainability, or that getting beyond capitalism would be the we would guarantee of that, but rather we would be able to sort of answer these questions differently and kind of pose some of the questions around like how should we do this in a more meaningful and genuine sense, and like actually take what I think are a lot of the conversations about environmental ethics and things that I think are kind of like post-capitalist conversations basically now, but that those could be like real and meaningful. That said, yeah, I agree. I agree that I think that simply adding the price tag or valuing nature in different ways won't, or like valuing nature just by adding a price tag isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. Although I think, if you had the difference between things like sometimes like accounting and market pricing too, where like you could, if you had a sort of state, even like social cost of carbon, there are ways to kind of incorporate a social cost in a way that could make, some significant policy changes. But in any case, I think it's not necessarily a question of just adding the price tag as sort of solving the problem. And I guess in opposition to the parliament of things, I think there is still sort of a question of like, how do we represent more than human nature in our political and economic systems? And I think like the parliament of things, I guess, like a vision of doing that in a kind of classically political institutional sense. And I think the pricing nature is, representing nature and sort of the form of, again, like in the realm of the market. And we would presumably in some other world need to do something that is not neither just one or the other. But I do try to take the agency or sort of like material or like what Latour would talk about as material agency, and Jean Baptiste actually literally describes natural agents, so I think it's very interesting. But I do try to take that seriously and attention to things like materiality and how those show up. But I'm not sure we know what kind of like set of institutions able to genuinely reflect that yet.
The two last questions. I'm also aware that they're returning to work where I've asked them to be for the duration of the panel. So please here on the front, middle, and please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Manish Malwani. I'm a science fiction writer and theorist of sorts. I'm very interested in the notion that the free gift is the commodity shadow. Commodity is a very spooky and weird thing in Marx's Capital, and it's connected to the way that relations of domination are obscured under capitalism. So curious if you thought at all while writing this book about the forms that nature takes under other modes of production, under feudalism or perhaps in like empires, and if that can shed any light where we think about it now.
And over here to Laura.
Hey, I'm Nathaniel Assault-Peterson. I'm a graduate student at Yale University. And I think my question actually is nicely consonant with this. This is lucky. I'm really interested in, this is also kind of going back to the question, I guess, of the state and like the sort of absent presence of the state in this book. I think one thing that I really, first of all, I love the book. And one of the things I really like is, I think your tracing out of sort of like market rule and class rule in a lot of these questions, which I think is actually incredibly helpful in elucidating and sort of like, since we didn't talk about that, maybe just like one word on that, just so that what I'm saying is clear. I mean, one of the points you make, and correct me if I'm sort of misphrasing this, is that there's a way where, nature is not subject to market rule in the same way that we are subject to market rule, i.e. we have to compete for wages and nature can't do this, right? Sort of roughly. But one of the questions I kind of then have is sort of how you think about the relationship between sort of market rule and sort of the market, which I think, looms large in the text as sort of like real abstraction in a certain way, right? It's like the market is the thing that sort of constitutes real abstraction and the sort of like reality of social relations beyond intention or experience even. And then the problem of like, not all social relations are market relations, because sometimes when we come to distinguishing between sort of like, the sort of problems that nature actually presents capital, it's always sort of the problems of the market, right, and the sort of the inability of market rule to sort of work. And I want to ask that because I think one of the, and this is like I guess the stakes of the question to me, right, is I think one of the really interesting things about the book is, and we haven't talked about it, which is also why I wanted to bring it up, is you sort of frame these problems of free gifts, right, as sites of like political contestation. So is that contestation about also the limits of the market, and how have you sort of been thinking about that, since the book has come out?
The last words from you, I think, is our last question. Okay, so briefly, I guess I would say, yeah, I mentioned the commodity as a spooky kind of entity, because it is, and I always did find it very interesting that Mark is like, oh, it's a strange and mysterious thing, and then like use value is just kind of like not mysterious at all. It's just there, just obvious, and I think that's just not giving enough credit to the spooky weirdness of use value and how it again sort of transforms in relation to a world of the commodity. But have I thought about writing about this in other like modes of production? Yes, no. Mostly because I don't have the expertise or knowledge or like ability to do it. But I would be very curious. I would love for somebody else to try to take up that question, because I'm sure I would learn a lot. I think it's probably beyond my just like capacity, to be perfectly frank. But I think it is a really interesting question that speaks to again sort of this like, how do we think about this in a longer history, or even like a longer, people who want to make a longer argument, it's a longer history of capitalism, because mine is mostly beginning in a kind of a classical, like like the classical political economists. So there's obviously kind of different start dates that people would want about when we really see. About the limits of the market and social relations that aren't market relations. I mean, I guess like one way of putting this, and I'm not sure if this will totally speak to the question, or I guess one of the things, like, so I do try to point to a number of places in the book where I think there are both struggles over like versions of the free gift problem, and efforts to constitute some other mode of valuation often, whether that's through like thinking about the rights of nature as a multi-species collective bargaining right, rather than a kind of like intrinsic valuation right, but one that can kind of mobilize these different claims, and claims that are more about use value and the kind of like effects of social pollution on physical bodies and ecosystems, rather than kind of just like a pure market relation, or thinking of the socialization. I talk about the socialization of nature and this attempt to sort of use again something like collective ownership or states to like set a different set different terms for how these things might be valued. And I guess maybe some of the questions like where and how can we reconstitute value within a capitalist society? Because I certainly don't want to say that there's no possibility for that, even if I think the general tendency is that we are driven by market and class rule and sort of, kind of relating to nature through the real abstraction. I still want to say that I do think there are these sort of points where there are at least moments of constituting things differently, even if we recognize that that's not sort of like then outside of capitalism. And then in fact, being, fighting from within capitalism is a powerful position rather than just kind of constituting struggles. I think often environmental struggles are conceived just like from the outside to be really challenging in some way. But I also want to really think about, I guess one of the things that I think is, I've tried to think about in the book on the limits of the market is actually the ways that even though I think we have on some sense like to like internalize and take for granted market valuation as an assessment of worth, and yet on the other hand haven't. And I think the free gift of nature is useful in politicizing value because it's like one of these places where you see this massive gap between what's sort of the value of something think it should be and what it is, and that can like raise these questions around, well, why isn't this thing valuable? And that I think can maybe help us kind of question capitalist valuation more broadly. And so I try to think like this, where there are like latent judgments about capitalist valuation in the book, whether it's around like why are you know, forms of reproductive labor that we think are some of the most valuable things people do, you know, so little, or why, you know, the processes that keep planet habitable are not valued at all, as points where we can maybe again run up not the limits. I mean, there are the limits of the market, but that can also be kind of places to start pushing our thinking of like, well, what beyond that kind of more like just like, I don't know, kind of the way that in mundane daily life you like look at a price and you're like, that's, you know, price value worth, and that makes us ask some of these questions more directly. So I'm not sure if this really like answers your question, but that's I can do. So we'll leave it there.